that it's 13:44, but that's close enough, at least for me. I'm William Gross. I'm kind of an odd bird for many different reasons, but one of them within the framework of this conference is because I am a private collector, not a public institution. And this institution here has really, for decades, been my second home. I used to spend 2 days a week in Jerusalem, and at least half of that was always spent here, down in the basement primarily. Welcome to the afternoon session. This is the grand slam of all sessions today. And I will start by reading the title of the session, but it takes 2 minutes, and that's going to come from Arthur's time. So, audiences of 21st century Judaica collections and their needs, nikudatayim, books, periodicals, photographs, ephemera, and digitally born content. And our presenter today is Arthur Kiron, whom I'm sure all of you know. Those of you who have visited the University of Pennsylvania and seen what he has done there will understand why he is the presenter today. And it is my pleasure to introduce a consummate professional and a truly close friend, Arthur.
Who? Oh. Ready here. I want to thank all of you for staying for the afternoon session. It may be a grand slam, but it's certainly one that after having eaten lunch, and I'm sure many of you are very tired or perhaps jet lagged, so thank you for coming to this afternoon session. I want to begin by offering my thanks to Aviad Stolman for the invitation to speak today and for all of his efforts to organize the program, this conference, the second conference. I also want to express my gratitude to the staff of the NLI for all their efforts, and particularly a last-minute effort by Rini Goldschmidt for letting me print out one single page of my presentation. Thank you, Rini, if you're here. Oh, she's not here? Oh, there you are. Thank you very much. And I especially would like to acknowledge my good friend, William Gross, who is a very special man who's made important contributions to modern Jewish culture, collecting, and he's here, I think, both in my mind as not only a private collector, but a public intellectual who's had a great impact on my own life. So I'd like to acknowledge William Gross. I'm going to frame my talk about basically patron-centric views of Judaica librarianship, focusing on this issue of needs, by framing it by two stories about two American soldiers. The first soldier died exactly 1 year ago. His name was Dr. Alfred Moldovan. Al was known to many of you here, but I'd just like to recall, for those of you who didn't know him, that Al was a veteran of the Second World War. He was a communist activist who fulfilled his mobilization, as they called it, by working as a family doctor in East Harlem for over 50 years. He was a founder of the Medical Committee for Human Rights, and he was a civil rights hero who was present at Selma and was a physician to Dr. Martin Luther King. He also, after all of that, still had time. He lived to be 92 years old, had another 45, 50 years to teach himself to be a Judaica collector, and he was one of the great experts in the world. And he had no background. He was not a university professor. He just had his own brain, and it served him well. Perhaps more than anyone else I've ever met, Al believed and practiced the philosophy that we must live and fight for others, not just for ourselves. He was a revolutionary in every sense of the word. And Al kept at his home a framed copy of the famous Bunting cloverleaf map, a copy of which is in the Lozowick collection here at the National Library. printed in 1581. And I thought it was a fitting symbol in several respects. Of course, it puts Jerusalem at the center of the world, and that's where we are today. But it also, I think, indicates two things about Al's understanding of the past. One is that we should think about the past in its completely unblemished, authentic form. We need to recognize the mistakes we've made in thinking about ourselves in the past. And it also, in looking at that map, I think it reminds me of his uncompromising impatience for anyone or anything opposed to intellectual freedom. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we've heard today, the debate about open access. And if there's one need that we need to think about and talk about, and which is at the center of my talk today, it is the meaning of intellectual freedom and open access. I begin my talk by referring to Al not only because today marks the one-year anniversary of his death, which happened on November 9th, 2013. I also invoke Al's name because he was among the first to call for collective action among Judaica curators, museum professionals, and private collectors to provide open access to all. Al thought about Judaica curatorship in social terms before the technology existed to realize his vision. In speaking about Judaica patrons or audiences, I ask you to consider the ways in which our work is being revolutionized before our eyes, not only technologically, but socially. Let's see here. Oh, good, it works. So we hear about revolutions, and I think it's an apt metaphor for what we're going through, whether it's a pendulum that swings back and forth, whether it is something that proceeds in an evolutionary direction. We certainly can witness the inversion of perceptions of the world, the decentering of things that were once considered central. In the humanities, we find a shift, a scholarly shift. Used to be you'd think about authors. Today we heard about the death of the author. We think about producers of content. Today we think about consumers of content, readers, and the reception of learning. I think in the library world, we've moved from a static understanding of data in terms of its inherent value, the individual object, to thinking dynamically about knowledge in relational terms. For libraries, there's been something of a Copernican revolution, a radical inversion of perceptions, practices, and priorities. We are learning to think relationally rather than in terms of center and periphery. We are learning to understand networks of knowledge rather than siloed sources of information. We are open now to considering new audiences, new expectations, and new patron needs. Perhaps nowhere has this shift been more dramatic than in the reorientation of libraries away from being collection repositories to becoming service hubs of sociability. What does this mean for Judaica curatorship? In the last decade, we've witnessed a dramatic shift by libraries from providing digital access to unique primary sources, such as individual rare manuscripts, to integrated search and discovery. So, for example, in Geniza studies, we not only try to find an individual fragment, but we try to find connections among fragments. And I think now we're moving towards the recognition of the opportunity to what I call play with the data, to think about how we can meaningfully learn from the abundance of information that Amiur, for example, referenced in his comment earlier today. What are we now to do with all of this abundance of riches that we have? One notable example, and that was alluded to by Catherine Eagleton from the British Library, is the idea of gamification. And I think that's a term that's not really well understood. I want to cite Kevin Werbach, who's actually a Penn professor in the Wharton School, in his 2012 book, which he co-wrote with Dan Hunter, called For the Win, How Game Thinking Can Revolutionize Your Business. According to Werbach and Hunter, gamification is the application of game elements and digital game design techniques to non-game problems, such as businesses and social impact challenges. Effective game leverage involves both psychology and technology in ways that can be applied outside the immersive environments of games themselves. Gaming is both very serious and quite playful. In short, collection building is no longer the most important focus of library priorities. It certainly is one among many dimensions of a complex physical and digital global infrastructure. But we're really now reorienting ourselves to focus on patron needs, and I'm asking you all to think about how we as curators can think about creating active learning environments. We're increasingly coming to understand that no collection stands alone. Like Geniza fragments, each piece is related to another, and each piece is related to an infinite potential of others that we may not even know. So just to review, what's this, they call it the sort of the standard narrative or the traditional view. Libraries are places where books are stored. Libraries should aspire to have every book in the world, as long as they don't catch on fire. The primary goal of a library is to build a collection, to keep a collection, to protect the collection, and for librarians to serve as gatekeepers to that content, and patron needs are secondary to collection building. Oh, shoot, sorry. I would say that form of collection development is a kind of idolatry. I'd like to suggest that building big collections for status and show at the expense of or to the neglect of patron services has become a kind of library idol worship. Oh, forward. Ah. Sorry for the interruption. I want those 2 minutes back. We didn't discuss technical difficulties. So how do we transcend this collections development hubris? I've mentioned that no collection is sufficient in and of itself. I think we've come to understand that all collections and each part of any collection are potentially related to an infinite number of others. I think that's what is important, and this is kind of the, if you want, the takeaway. What is important is not what you have, but what you do with what you have. Libraries will be known for the services they deliver, not by the collections they own. Any library can become world-renowned by the services they have, and all of us, no matter how great our collections, should provide access to the content we control and are responsible for so people can use that material. So coming back to patron needs in particular, who are the audiences of Judaica? What do they want? And how do we assess our ability to meet their needs? And here I want to invoke an image which I hope will be of interest to some of you. This is an African-American artist named Jacob Lawrence, 20th century artist. He was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He formed a kind of a dynamic cubist style that was rooted in the shapes and colors of Harlem. The point is here, not only I think the beauty of his particular painting called The Library, but the fact that he was an outsider. He was denied access to information in school. Looking back at his high school years, he remembered that black culture was, quote, never studied seriously like regular subjects. And so he had to learn on his own. And how did he do it? How did he teach himself? He went to the library. That's one of our audience members. So is Dr. Moldovan, so is Jacob Lawrence. Libraries, whether they're private or public, I think all of us have audiences we don't even know. At Penn, I want to just give you quickly some examples of the way in which the Penn Libraries in the last 15 years I've been there has transformed this culture of service. One of them, which has really come as a surprise to me, has been the rethinking of physical space. Right now, the National Library of Israel, of course, is planning to build a new building. And the way in which physical space is conceived is increasingly a matter of how active learning environments are structured. Okay? New library spaces for group study are not only designed to host larger numbers of people. That's a traditional group study space. A bunch of people gathered together. But they also are opportunities, and in the Penn Library, we have such spaces for new pedagogical methods to be employed. Okay. John McDermott, who heads instructional technology, which is one of the aspects of computing at Penn, it's a big operation within the School of Arts and Sciences, drew my attention to the, quote, Scale Up project. This is the student-centered active learning for undergraduate programs. And what is that? It's an experimental pedagogical approach first developed at the University of North Carolina State University, Raleigh, by Robert Beichner. And without going into details, you can look at this. But basically what he's done is he's taken a physical environment and he's created round tables where groups of 3 students can talk together. And in talking together, in learning together, they have much more effective outcomes, learning outcomes. The notion of the seminar, the lecture, what I'm doing right now, is not the most effective way for us to be communicating. How can we transform that? There's a footnote to that particular, there's a study that came out from MIT, which I'd just like to allude to, which measured brain activity during seminars and brain activity during active like labs and active engagement opportunities. It's almost like there's a flat line when students are in seminars. When students are actively engaged, the brain activity jumps. These are demonstrated, empirically demonstrated learning outcomes with literally measured brain active measurements. There's some wonderful examples of this at Penn, of how we've actually built these environments and how we employ technologies and deploy our staff to promote various types of learning activities. But for the sake of time, I'm going to just gloss over that. But I invite you to go to the Penn Library's website to look at the programs that are run on a daily basis by the Weigel Information Commons, to go to the Kislak Center and look at the media labs that we have there, and to think about how that we as a research library are committing ourselves to these new forms of library pedagogy and library services. The new emphasis on what's called TEAL, a term developed at MIT, or technology-enabled active learning, has been studied in depth actually right here in Israel by Yehudit Judy Dori. I don't know her, but I've been reading something of hers, who works at the Technion. Maybe some of you know her. And she's been doing this in partnership with John Belcher at MIT, at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Their research has broad implications, I would argue, for library digital pedagogy. They have demonstrated how TEAL, technology-enabled active learning, how TEAL involves, quote, media-rich software for simulation and visualization in freshman physics courses, carried out in specially designed classrooms to facilitate group interaction, social revolution in pedagogy. And it works. Coming back to Judaica curatorship, to what extent will Judaica library spaces, both physically and virtually, to what extent will the National Library of Israel respond to these new approaches to student or patron-centric models of learning? What would a patron-centric model of Judaica librarianship look like? I'm not here to answer the question, but I'm just trying to figure it out myself and present it to you as my colleagues for discussion if you're interested. I would argue that Judaica curators are already performing the role of facilitators of learning, helping patrons to formulate their own questions and participate in their self-motivated processes of research and discovery. But what we haven't done yet is think systematically about the implications of patron-centric librarianship for the ways in which we build collections and provide access to them, both physically and virtually. In physical terms, I'd be interested to know if any of you have been involved in designing these new pedagogical learning spaces within libraries. In digital terms, I want to acknowledge the work of Dov Weiner here, who's contributed so much to the development of the semantic web and linked data. But I also would ask us to think not only about the access and the incredible enhanced access that Dov has given us and that Judaica Europeana has promoted, but also to think about how digital literacy should be defined in Jewish terms. It's not just a linguistic problem. It's not just a matter of having to know 27 languages and 5 different alphabets. I haven't mastered all of them. I don't know how many of you have. But that's the least of our problems. The new technologies offer challenges, but they also are tools. And as tools, I think we have to grapple with how we can use these tools to teach library patrons to access data. The movement for open, unrestricted access to our collections and data enrichment of our holdings is an obvious starting point, but to move from access to integration to active learning. Access, sort of first generation, integration and discovery in the second generation, and now active learning will require many changes. At the basic level of access, we find persistent reluctance to embrace truly open access due to fears that content may be misused, either ideologically or through commercialization. To me, this is a cost-benefit analysis, not a moral issue. I ask you, what is the real cost of restricting access to our resources in terms of limiting use because of our fears? Seeing a hate group use an anti-Semitic image freely available from Penn's Beitler collection of the Dreyfus Affair, or seeing how a beautiful manuscript in our collection might be misused and commercialized, I would say is upsetting and disconcerting, but it's the price we pay in a democratic society. Speech that is offensive and disturbing, and that we choose to limit access to it because of those very facts, is a betrayal of what we stand for, I believe, as librarians. So this brings me to my final point. Who are our audiences for our Judaica? I want to tell you about my other American soldier. I mentioned Dr. Moldovan, and consider what an unlikely library patron he was. A few years ago, I was giving a lecture to Penn alumni in Florida, and I concluded by showing the Survivor Talmud. Many of you may know this text, printed in Munich, Heidelberg, in the DP camps in the American zone after the Second World War. And it's a Talmud, of course, and after the talk, a gentleman came up to me and thanked me, and I was very grateful for his kind words, and he said, I want to explain why I'm grateful, why I'm thanking you. He says, I was an American soldier, this guy's not Jewish, who liberated Dachau. He was there at the Dachau liberation, okay? What does that mean? If there's ever a Jewish document, that's a Jewish document. Who's it dedicated to? The dedication reads to the American Armed Forces. I think that's as powerful a statement as you can find of who our potential audiences and unimagined and unanticipated audiences are. In conclusion, in this talk about the needs of Judaica patrons, I've tried to summarize a shift I have perceived over the last 10 years from access to integration to active learning. I've tried to ask the question what that shift means for Judaica curatorship. I've tried to argue that by transcending traditional barriers to open access, by forging new relationships, and by sharing opportunities for learning, we as curators are helping to revolutionize the classical delivery system of human knowledge, the library itself. This Copernican-like library revolution has not only been technological, it also has been social. New approaches to patron needs through active learning models of library pedagogy and digital technologies will help to strengthen what has always been the quiet virtue of libraries, the freedom they confer on individuals to pursue learning wherever it may take them, with whomever they like, unimpeded across space and time. Thank you.
If we have time at the end, I'll tell you another story about Dr. Moldovan, or at least a detail of one. But now, we get to hear from the person who I think runs the biggest archive of any of those that are represented at this conference. And Yaacov Lozowick, we welcome you, appreciate your participation. ואתה יכול לדבר בעברית, אם אתה רוצה, כי יש בסדר.
How long do I have? 15 minutes. First of all, I want to thank the good friends from the National Library who invited me here. I'm not a librarian. Well, I see at least one other person who's also not a librarian here. I'm the state archivist. Just a word about what that means. It means I have two jobs. One of them is to run the State Archive of the State of Israel, which is the archive of the government in its broadest terms. And the second is to coordinate, regulate, look at, observe, kvetch about the entire field of archives in Israel. I admit that I spend much more of my time on the first than on the second, because when I got this job a few years ago, I found the situation in the Israel State Archives and its subsidiaries so extraordinarily dire, not to say catastrophic, that I have very little time for the second. But as things get better, there will be more time for the second, and I do, along with others, colleagues, give thoughts to what needs to be done in the broader field of archives in the State of Israel. I listened very carefully to what you said, and I found myself agreeing with the first half and the last 10%. And then there was about 40% in the middle where I saw it differently. Archives are different from libraries in one very fundamental way, and that is that we fold it. If we do our job correctly, if we do our job correctly, we automatically have a unique collection that nobody else has, because an archive collects, it's a living archive, an archive of an organization. The archive collects the documentation created by the organization. As long as the organization is creating documentation, the archive will collect that. And only the archive has it, nobody else has it, because it goes to the archive. So on that level, archives are different than libraries. We don't have to strut the size or the wealth of our collection as against that of anybody else, because what we have is unique, and we don't have what everybody else has. So it works both ways. There's much less competition on that level. Again, assuming that we're doing our job correctly, which is a very large assumption. The second thing is about giving access, and here, so I agree with you about that our first, or I'm not agreeing, I'm not disagreeing. Our first job is to collect, but unlike libraries, we theoretically have an easier job in collecting than libraries do, because we don't have to go out and make certain we're buying everything that's being produced or everything else. If we have set our system up correctly, it'll reach us with a certain amount of effort, but it will reach us because that's the law. It has to come to us. And we can get carried away in that. It is possible for archives to invest so much of the effort into building their collection, into making certain that what's supposed to reach them reaches them, that they will forget the second aspect, which is giving service to the public. And here I was fully in agree with you when you in your first part. The single most important thing that we can do beyond building our collection is reaching our public in a better way than the past. I have absolutely not the slightest disagreement with you on that. And the technology is giving us a totally different scope of whom we can reach, and how we can reach them is, I won't say it's obvious, because not all of my colleagues agree with me, but it's true. The part where I found myself agreeing with you less, and this is because, for whatever reason, is the space. We, next week, are shutting down the building that we've been in for the last 23 years. Not me, I've been there 3 years. But the building the State Archive has been in for the last 23 years, we're shutting it down next week. The reading room's already been shut down for a few weeks. We're moving to another building. It's the building we're in right now is a dilapidated office building in the wrong part of town. And we're moving into a snazzy office building in a different part of town. And neither of the buildings are important. And there's a reading room, and archives have far fewer patrons who come to their reading rooms in the National Library. You people have more in a week than we have in 2 months. But it doesn't bother us, because we're in a process of taking the entire thing and using technology in order to give access on the internet to everybody. And the reading room doesn't really interest us, which is why the entire section where you talked about let's set up facilities that use space to facilitate learning and all that part, this may be an issue for you. It's, in my mind, it's not an issue for us. I don't think there's a famous case in archives now, what used to be called the Public Record Office. It's called the English National Archive. I don't know, 10 years ago or so, they didn't have enough budget to replace the carpets. The carpets were getting worn out all the time, and they didn't want to be spending their money, instead of buying books, on replacing the carpets. And so they said that they would start putting stuff on the internet, more and more of their collections on the internet. And the assumption was the more is on the internet, the fewer people will come to the Public Records Office. Of course, it didn't work that way. The more they put on the internet, the more people knew that the Public Records Office existed, and the more people came to the Public Records Office, and they need even more money for replacing the carpets. And I read this, by the way, not in a library science thing, not in an archive. I read this in The Economist. Right? So this was it's a real story about the fact that you put things online, sometimes more people will come to your physical space, and yet I'm insisting the physical space does not particularly interest me, and we're not putting efforts, or anyways not significant efforts, into this physical space, because what we are trying to do, and hopefully those of you, if any of you want to visit our website, please don't. The website that we have right now was designed in the 18th century and has not been updated since the 18th century, and please don't go there. But next year, June, July, something like that, we hope to put up a real website designed in the 21st century, and from then we will begin to try and offer some of the services that we think can be offered in the 21st century to publics. And here, indeed, I'm fully in agreement with some of what you said. It will be different publics. Because who comes to the State Archive now? Basically, two groups. Researchers, most of them historians, although not only, and people who, for legal reasons, need a document proving that their grandfather was their grandfather, or that their great-grandfather twice removed owned a piece of property which is near where they want to move, or those sort of things. Those are the two main segments of the public. We're missing 99.9% of the citizenry in Israel. We're missing everybody who's not in Israel. And we are convinced that by taking large amounts of data, connected to large amounts of scanned documentation, organized in useful ways, we should be able to interest very large publics who perhaps may not even know that they're using the State Archive, and it doesn't really make any difference to me. Our assumption is that a lot of people are using Google at any given moment to ask questions which our material has answers to. And if they could get our answers when they use Google, I don't really care if they even know they're getting it from us. They'll see after a while they're getting it from us. But the point is not to bring them to our website. The point is that if they're having a conversation about something where we have information, we want to insert our information into their conversation. And finally, I'll give an example of the kind of publics that we need to reach and we're not reaching at all, and that we hope that the digital revolution will help us to reach. A number of months ago, maybe a year ago by now, two mathematics professors from Haifa University came to talk to me. And they knew that they were from two different departments. Haifa University has more than one mathematics department. And if you think I can tell you which is which, I can't. From my perspective, they were both professors of mathematics. And they wanted to use our database in order to build algorithms that would work on our database in order to answer social questions about how society develops in the State of Israel, but they were interested in the mathematical aspect of it. Can we use mathematics to trace social patterns and so on and so forth? And they came to us assuming that we had a very large database that they could use, and this would be a great idea for them, it would be cool for us. To the best of my knowledge, no mathematics professor had ever come to the State Archive before. And unfortunately, the database that we had to offer them at the time was nowhere near what they needed. But the database that we should have a year from now, and not to say 5 years from now, and certainly 10 years from now, needs to be a database that professors of mathematics use. Because why not? Big data and all sorts of other things that mathematicians do and statisticians do, it would be fascinating to use our material. And we want them to be able to use our material. So that's where some of the parts were in full agreement, and some of them were not quite.
For the largest archive, it was the shortest presentation. And we thank you because you covered everything. Not having an active website can be an advantage at some times. Our next responder is Hezi Amiur of the National Library. Runs what for me is one of the most interesting sections. And we'll get to Yoel in the Judaica section, which of course is my heart. But the history of Israel is awfully important, and for the first time is starting to be documented in the way that it should. And that's because of Hezi.
תודה רבה. אני אדבר עברית.
Simultaneous translation of things outside if you need.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
אנחנו שמענו עד כה, שמענו גם מהדברים שארתור אמר וגם הדברים שיעקב הציג בקצרה. כמו שאני מבין את זה, אפילו שניהם התייחסו לזה בצורה זו או אחרת. מדובר במוסדות שמיועדים בראש ובראשונה בספרייה האוניברסיטאית והארכיון, כמו שיעקב אמר, אצלנו הכל ייחודי, שפונים לקהל מאוד מאוד מצומצם ושואפים להרחיב את הקהלים שלהם, וזה בעצם גם הנושא של הפאנל שלנו היום. אני רוצה להעלות כמה תהיות שעולות בעיקר כמובן מהעבודה שלנו כאן בספרייה הלאומית, ובזה אנחנו כנראה קצת שונים מרוב האוספים שאתם מופקדים עליהם. ואני, באופן סכמטי, הספרייה הלאומית מבחינה את קהלי היעד שלה לשני קהלים עיקריים. אחד זה קהילת המחקר, והשני הוא הציבור הרחב. כך אנחנו קוראים לזה, באופן סכמטי. אני רוצה קצת להמשיך בדרכו, קצת של פרופסור יורם אשת אלקלעי שדיבר כאן בבוקר, ובעצם הוא הציג את השינויים גם בהרגלי הקריאה, ואחר כך גם בהרגלי הפרסום או הכתיבה, האוטורשיפ שהוא הציג, וללכת אולי עוד צעד אחד קדימה, ולשאול האם אנחנו גם בדרך לשינויים גם בהרגלי המחקר של החוקרים. בואו נדבר קצת על קהילת המחקר, ומה שקורה איתה בזמן האחרון. הכל ברור שנובע בראש ובראשונה מהתפתחויות טכנולוגיות מהירות ביותר, שיוצרות גם שינויים תרבותיים, שכמובן משפיעות על אופי המחקר, על נושא המחקר וכדומה. אני חושב שאנחנו היום נמצאים במצב שאנחנו לא יכולים להעריך, נכון להיום אנחנו לא יכולים להעריך מה יהיו הצרכים, השינויים הם כל כך מהירים שאנחנו לא יכולים להעריך מה יהיו הצרכים של קהילת המחקר בעתיד, לטווח נאמר הבינוני והרחוק, ואני לא בטוח שתהיה נקודת זמן מכאן ואילך שאנחנו נוכל בכלל לומר שאנחנו יכולים להעריך מה יהיה בעתיד, בניגוד למה שהיה בעבר, שאפשר היה לצפות טוב יותר מה קהילת המחקר תצטרך. זה נובע, כולנו בעצם פה מופקדים על אוספים שעוסקים בראש ובראשונה, ויעקב הדגים את זה, במדעי הרוח, אבל היום המחקר הוא מאוד, כידוע, אינטרדיסציפלינרי, מעורבב, חוקרים במדעי החברה, נזקקים למקורות של מדעי הרוח, חוקרים מדעי הרוח משתמשים בנתונים של מדעי החברה. כמובן העניין של שפע המידע, אנחנו נמצאים בעידן של שפע מידע שכזה שפשוט אי אפשר להקיף את כולו, אף אדם לא יכול להקיף את כולו, ואין ספק, לי אין ספק שזה כמובן שינה וכבר משנה את אופי המחקר, את האופי הבסיסי ביותר של המחקר. פעם חוקר אמור היה להקיף את כל מה שנוגע לנושא שלו. היום אף אחד לא מתיימר לזה ובטח לא בעתיד. הפיתוח של המקורות כתוצאה מההתקדמות הטכנולוגית משפיע גם הוא ישירות על אופי המחקר. אני אתן כאן דוגמה אחת שהוצגה גם במושב של הפוסטרים. אתר העיתונות, אולי גם אתרי עיתונות אחרים, בהקשר שלנו אתר העיתונות היהודית ללא ספק שינה את אופי המחקר גם בכך שיש הרבה יותר ציטוטים מתוך עיתונות וגם בכך שעצם העיתונות הפכה להיות מקור לגיטימי הרבה יותר ממה שהייתה פעם כמקור היסטורי. בעתיד, וזה לא עתיד רחוק במיוחד, כך יהיה אותו דבר עם האינטרנט, כלומר היום לא נמצא הרבה ציטוטים לאתרי אינטרנט למשל, בעתיד אין ספק שזה יהיה מקור מחקרי מרכזי. שלא לדבר על יישומים עתידיים, ככל שיהיה לנו יותר ויותר חומר דיגיטלי וככל שנדע מבחינה טכנולוגית יותר טוב לעבד אותו, אז יש שכבות מדעיות נוספות של מדידות של טקסטים וכדומה, שבכלל יכול להיות שיפתחו שדות מחקר חדשים. רוב החומר, מבחינת המקורות, רוב החומר הוא דיגיטלי מלכתחילה, אנחנו יודעים את זה, את רוב החומר הדיגיטלי, הרבה ממנו אפשר למצוא באינטרנט, גם זה לא את כולו, אפילו אם נרחיב את כל האינטרנט, עדיין לא כל החומר הדיגיטלי נמצא באינטרנט, והוא נמצא רק במקומות לא מפורסם בכלל. עוד גורם מאוד מרכזי זה שמי שיוצר היום מאגרי מידע, מקורות מחקריים, כיום הם כבר לא רק ספרנים או חוקרים או עוצרים. היום היוזמה נמצאת המון בידי טכנולוגים בכלל, אדם אחד שפתאום מרים איזשהו פרויקט שמביא בשורה גדולה מאוד למחקר, אנחנו בתור עוצרים צריכים לשתף פעולה עם פרויקטים כאלה, אנחנו עושים את זה כל הזמן, אפשר לומר שבמקום ליזום היום אנחנו עושים הרבה יותר שיתופי פעולה, ושיתופי פעולה לא רק עם עמיתים שלנו, אלא עם באמת יזמים עצמאיים כאלה. שלא לדבר על שיתופי פעולה בינינו, בין כל האנשים שנמצאים כאן. וכבר דיברתי על זה שהשפע הזה גם ייצור שינויים באופי המחקר. הקהל הרחב, מי זה הקהל הרחב? אפשר למנות כל מיני קבוצות בתוך הקהל הרחב. הקהל הרחב יכול להיות תלמידים בבתי הספר, יכול להיות מורים, יכול להיות פנסיונרים, שיש יותר ויותר פנסיונרים שפונים למחקר עצמאי בכל מיני רמות. בלוגרים, הרבה בלוגרים הם מפיצים, הם מעין חוקרים שנזקקים לחומר ומפיצים את החומר. עיתונאים, אני פה בעבודתי, אני מודה, אני עסוק הרבה מאוד בקשר עם עיתונאים שאנחנו בוחרים בהם כדי להפיץ את המידע שיש אצלנו. אותו קהל רחב, ולא רק הוא היום פחות מה שנקרא, פחות מדפדף ויותר מחפש. זאת אומרת, היום הרגלי המחקר שלנו משתנים, שלנו לא רק בתור חוקרים או בתור עוצרים, אלא בתור ציבור רחב. יש המון מקורות שהם לא ספריים, כן? דיברתי על עיתונים, דיברתי על אתרי אינטרנט, אבל יש גם הרבה מקורות שהם בכלל לא באות כתובה, כמו שספריות נהגו לאצור בעבר. למשל, תצלומים, אודיו יכול להיות מוזיקה, יכול להיות גם רדיו, שידורי רדיו, בישראל זה מאוד ריכוזי, אז אין הרבה, ואותו דבר בטלוויזיה. אפמרה, נושא שדיברנו עליו גם הקדשנו לו מושב בכנס הקודם. החיפוש במקורות כאלה הוא תלוי מאוד בטכנולוגיה. יש המון פיתוחים טכנולוגיים שהוזכרו פה באמת על קצה המזלג, שיאפשרו חיפוש, יאפשרו מחקר, שימוש במקורות האלה באופן שקשה מאוד לדמיין אותו, שקשה היה לדמיין אותו בעבר, ואפילו היום קשה להבין איזה אופקים זה יפתח בפנינו. אני רק נותן דוגמאות. המרה של אודיו לטקסט, זיהוי תמונות אוטומטי, גם בסטילס ואולי גם בווידאו, תוכנות תרגום שמאפשרות לנו לתרגם טקסטים משפות עתיקות או משפות מודרניות לשפות אחרות, ועוד כהנה וכהנה, יש עוד הרבה דברים. וכשאני מגיע לתרומה נוספת של הקהל הרחב, אני רוצה להזכיר דבר שאני חושב שעדיין לא הוזכר כאן, וזה ההיבט של שיתוף הקהל הרחב בטיוב המידע שלנו, מה שאנחנו קוראים מיקור המונים או crowd sourcing. ה-crowd sourcing הזה הוא לא רק מאפשר לנו לטייב את המידע שיש בידינו, וזה הכרחי כשיש כל כך הרבה מידע, אלא שהוא יוצר מידע חדש, ואת זה באמת גם הזכיר פרופסור אשת אלקלעי. וזה מעלה גם עוד שאלה, שאנחנו נתקלים בה הרבה מאוד, שמטרידה את הספרנים ואת האוצרים, ואת מנהלי הארכיונים, איך אנחנו בכלל מבחינים בין מידע מקצועי, אני אומר במרכאות מקצועי, שמגיע מספרנים, מקטלגים, ארכיונאים, לבין מידע שמגיע מהציבור, ולדעתי, והדעה הזאת היא הדעה שלי, לא הדעה שמשותפת פה לכולם, לא יהיה מנוס מהוספת המידע הזה שמגיע מהציבור בצורה לא מסוננת, באופן כלשהו לצד המידע המקצועי. דיברתי הרבה על הציבור הרחב, ודיברתי על המחקר, אבל יכול להיות שכל כך הרבה פירטתי שאולי גם קהילת המחקר היא כל כך רחבה ומגוונת, וגם בוודאי הציבור הרחב הוא כל כך רחב ומגוון, שבעצם אולי לא אמרתי כלום, כי אנחנו בעצם מדברים על כל כך הרבה ונשארים בלי שום דבר ביד. איך אני יכול לשרת גם קהל רחב שמורכב מזה ומזה ומילדים ומקשישים ומחוקרים של מדעי החברה ושל מדעי הרוח ושל כל מיני נישות, ואנחנו יודעים שיש מאגרי מידע חשובים מאוד שמיועדים לנישות מחקריות מאוד מאוד ספציפיות. אז מה אני עושה עם כל מה שאמרתי? אני מניח שכל מה שמעניין את הקהל הרחב, ראשית אני מניח שכל מה שמעניין את הקהל הרחב, כלומר אולי הילדים שלנו, הנכדים שלכם, בני המשפחות שלנו, יעניין בסופו של דבר, אם לא כבר עכשיו, את קהילת המחקר. זאת אומרת, אין מידע שהוא מיועד רק לקהל הרחב. הנחה שנייה היא שכולם נמצאים ברשתות החברתיות, והרשת החברתית היא קהל יעד נוסף בפני עצמו. שוב, זה עוד פעם מגדיל את כל מה שאמרתי, זה קהל יעד שהוא כל כך רחב, שהוא הכל וזה בעצם שום דבר. אז אני מעלה כאן תהייה, מסקנה לא מבוססת, מסקנה שאני מזמין אתכם לשאול את עצמכם כמוני. כשאנחנו עושים היום פרויקטים, ואני מדבר כמובן על פרויקטים פרויקטים של Open Access, כן? פרויקטים שיהיו ברשת, בראש ובראשונה, כמעט בכל המקרים. יכול להיות שאם אנחנו נעמיד לנגד עינינו את הציבור הרחב ואת מה שמעניין אותו, מה שמעניין את הציבור הרחב זה לא בדיוק, למרות שהוא כל כך רחב, זה לא בדיוק מה שמעניין את קהילת המחקר. יכול להיות, דובר כאן על כמה סבלנות יש לנו לקרוא היום במחשב עמוד אחד, בוודאי יותר מעמוד אחד, לעומת כמה סבלנות שיש לנו להסתכל על תמונה ולדפדף הלאה. יכול להיות שאם אנחנו נראה את הקהל, את הציבור הרחב, את הפורמטים שהוא מחפש כקהל יעד, אנחנו נשרת בצורה טובה גם את קהילת המחקר בעתיד, שאנחנו כאמור לא יודעים מה היא תרצה, במה היא תשתמש בעתיד. אנחנו נמשיך לעשות תמיד מאגרי מידע ייעודיים למחקר, אין תחליף לדבר הזה, והספרייה הלאומית או כל ספרייה או כל אוסף חייב לדאוג שהשימוש בחומרים שנמצאים בידיו, או שוב, חומרים שהוא מטפל בהם באופן דיגיטלי, יגיע גם אל קהילת המחקר שתעשה בו את השימוש המסורתי של מקורות, ובעצם תמשיך לפתח את משאבי הרוח. אבל ככל שאנחנו נדע, ננסה להבין יותר טוב את הציבור הרחב, לא עד הסוף, כמו שאמרתי. אנחנו באמת נשרת גם את קהילת המחקר. אני גם חושב, בתור משפט אחרון, מילא הספרייה הלאומית שהיא פועלת על פי חוק והיא אמורה לשרת את הציבור לפי החוק, אולי גם ארכיון המדינה אותו דבר, אבל גם האוספים שאתם אחראים עליהם, האם לנצח תהיה זכות קיום למוסד שאפילו באופן של open access ואפילו כשהכל יהיה דיגיטלי וברשת, ישמש רק קהילה קטנה של חוקרים ששייכים למוסד הזה, או שיבואו להתארח במוסד הזה, או שמתעניינים בחומר שהמוסד הזה עוצר? אני לא בטוח. בישראל אני עוד פחות בטוח שתהיה זכות קיום למי שלא רואה לנגד עיניו את הציבור הרחב. אז אלה השאלות שאני מעלה, גם בהמשך לדברים ששמעתי. תודה.
Thank you, Hezi. last but most certainly not least, in my heart at least, is the man who has succeeded Aviad, who began sowing the field and reaping very richly in the field of Judaica in the most general sense. And since that is my field, that is the person with whom I was in contact. And Yossi, I'm afraid you're going to be the next, Yoel, you're going to be the next victim. So we wait to hear from you, please.
Well, I certainly have not succeeded, Aviad. I think I'm working on apprenticeship. That's the status I'm hoping for. And I'm also going to speak in Hebrew. My fears of the spirit of Eliezer ben Yehuda remain in place. ואני גם הולך קצת לחזור על הדברים של חזי, אולי מנקודת מבט טיפה אחרת, אבל אני נוטה להסכים איתו, אבל אני אציג את הדברים, אני חושב, טיפה אחרת, ואני רוצה להציג 4 נקודות מרכזיות, שכל אחת ואחת קשורה אחת לשנייה. א', אני חושב שהצרכים והאג'נדות המחקריות והלימודיות ישתנו בדרכים שאנחנו לא יכולים לצפות אותם מראש. היה פעם לא מזמן שהיסטוריה אמיתית הייתה היסטוריה פוליטית והיסטוריה אינטלקטואלית, ופתאום במונחים היסטוריים אנחנו מגלים שהיסטוריה חברתית ולימודי תרבות ונקודת מבט של מלמטה למעלה הופכים להיות חלק נכבד במדעי הרוח בכלל, במדעי החברה, ואני לא חושב שאנחנו יכולים לצפות מראש את אג'נדת המחקר שתהיה בעוד דור או 2 דורות, ואנחנו צריכים לקחת בחשבון שהמתודולוגיות והטכנולוגיות שהיום נראים כהכי חדשים, ככובשים מחדש את העולם, בעוד 20 שנה כבר יהיו ישנים, כמו אותם מתודות שלפני 20 שנה היו חדישים, והיום אנחנו כבר עוברים עליהם. אנחנו במידה מסוימת זה מעמיד אותנו כאוצרים במצב של הורים, שאנחנו מקבלים את ההחלטות הטובות ביותר שאנחנו מרגישים שאנחנו יכולים לקבל, ואנחנו יודעים שהילדים שלנו הולכים להאשים אותנו בטעויות שאנחנו נעשה, למרות הרצון הטוב. אז אנחנו מקבלים החלטות עכשיו לגבי מה לאסוף ומה להנגיש ומה לשמר, לאור ציפיות שלנו שמה שהולך להיות בעוד כמה דורות, אבל בעצם אנחנו לא יודעים גם מהצד הטכנולוגי וגם מהצד המחקרי. נקודת ב' שגם קשורה לדמות הזאת של ההורות, שהתפקיד שלנו נותנים לחשוב, זה גם מוזכר מספר פעמים, שהמטרה של הספרייה היא לאסוף את החומר ולהשאיר אותו על המדפים ולתת לחוקרים וללומדים ולקהל הרחב לבוא, לפתוח את הספרים, להסתכל וללמוד, ואנחנו פסיביים במידה מסוימת במשחק הזה, אבל אני חושב שזה לא נכון. השאלה שצריכה לעמוד בפנינו זה לא רק מה הקהל ירצה רוצה עכשיו וירצה בעוד דור או 2 דורות, אלא מה אנחנו רוצים שהם ירצו, מפני שיש לנו מקום בעיצוב המחקר והלמידה שיהיו בשנים הבאות, ואני יכול לחשוב על 1001 דוגמאות. פרופסור שווקה לא נמצא איתנו אני חושב היום, אבל כאחד שייסד את פרויקט השו"ת של אוניברסיטת בר אילן, כל מי שמתעסק הם במדעי יהדות המחקריים, הם בלימוד תורה במובן המסורתי והדתי של המילה, זה פשוט שינה את פני הדברים, זה אפשר כל מיני דברים, וזה שינה את כלי העבודה של החוקר והלומד. הוא פתאום לא צריך לדעת איפה נמצא כל דבר, הוא יכול על ידי החיפוש הזה. עכשיו, זה כבר לא חדש, זו עוד דוגמה לטכנולוגיה שהייתה חדשה לפני דור או 2, ועכשיו טכנולוגיה כבר לא חדשה, אבל מה שאנחנו עושים כאוצרים, הדרך שבו אנחנו מציגים את הדברים, ישנה את אופי המחקר והלמידה. זה לא ממש נכון שתורה מונחת בקרן זווית וכל מי שרוצה ליטול יבוא וייטול. התורה לא מונחת בקרן זווית, אנחנו מעצבים את התורה באותה קרן זווית ומנסים למשוך, והחוקרים והלומדים הרבה פעמים מחפשים מתחת לפנס. כל מי שלימד פעם דוקטורנטים או מסטרנטים אומר, טוב, הדוקטורט הטוב היחיד הוא דוקטורט גמור, מה אפשר לעשות במסגרת היכולות שלנו, ואם החומר נמצא באינטרנט, אם החומר נמצא בדרך מונגשת, אז יהיה אפשר להשתמש בו ואנשים ישתמשו בו. ג' וזה גם חוזר על הדברים שחזי אמר, מה המקום של מוסדות ריכוזיים בעולם הדיגיטלי. אני לא מעלה את השאלה הזאת כדי להגיד שאין מקום, אני חושב שיש מקום, אבל אנחנו צריכים לחשוב בצורה מסודרת ובצורה מעמיקה על המקום הזה. אם אנחנו חושבים על פרויקטים כמו ויקיפדיה, אם אנחנו חושבים על ה-crowd sourcing ועל פרויקטים כאלה, אנחנו מבינים שהרבה מאוד גורמים חיצוניים קטנים ופחות ממוסדים יכולים לעשות דברים שספרייה או מוסד ריכוזי פחות יכול לעשות, ואני חושב על פרויקטים כמו hebrewbooks.org, שזה פרויקט מאוד קטן עם תקציב מינימלי, שבעצם הם זורקים ב-PDF לאינטרנט כל ספר קדוש, על פי הגדרתם באינטרנט, ואם מישהו כותב להם ואומר שזה בזכויות יוצרים, אז הם מיד מורידים, וגם אם מישהו היה תובע אותם, לא היה יוצא מזה כלום, כי מה בדיוק אפשר לקבל מהם? אין להם משאבים לתת בתביעה. ומה המקום שלנו כמוסדות ריכוזיים, או כספרייה לאומית עוד יותר, בהקשר הזה? האם אנחנו יכולים לשחק תפקיד oiling the wheels, בשימון המעגלים, בעזרה, בשיתופי פעולה, בנתינת משאבים וכאלה למוסדות או פרויקטים שצומחים מלמטה? האם אנחנו יכולים ליזום פרויקטים, אבל להשתמש בכוחות של ה-crowd sourcing ולמצוא את לא רק קהילת המחקר כצרכנים, אלא גם כיוצרים בחזרה ותורמים בחזרה למטה-דאטה, לקישורים בין נושאים שאנחנו, אין לנו את הזמן או היכולות לשים בהם קישורים. והדבר הרביעי והאחרון, אני חושב שהנכדים והנינים שלנו לא יסלחו לנו אם אנחנו לא מאוד מאוד פעילים בקיצור האינטרנט הישראלי וקיצור האינטרנט היהודי. זה פשוט לא נכון שדבר שנמצא באינטרנט אף פעם לא ייעלם, זה פשוט עובדה לא נכונה, ואני יודע שאנחנו בתור ספרייה לאומית עובדים בכיוון הזה, אבל האינטרנט היהודי קיים הרבה מעבר ל-URL שמסתיים עם ה-IL, שאנחנו יכולים על פי חוק לקצור, ואנחנו צריכים בצורה שיתופית, כל המוסדות ביחד, אני חושב לתת דחיפה מחודשת לכיוון הזה. תודה רבה.
I purposely tried to be a taskmaster with the speakers because I really wanted at this session to leave as much time as possible for questions, because in essence, the way I looked at the subject of this session, it's the summation of most of what the Congress is about, because I don't think that anybody really is going to be coming here and learning new technical methods for archiving or digitizing or anything else. But you may learn about new approaches, different ways of thinking, and the only way that happens is through discussion. So please, who wants to ask the first question?
What's your Moldovan story?
Hmm?
What's your Moldovan story?
I'll tell it afterwards. Please.
My questions or comments are directed to Arthur. First of all, I think when you're talking about collections versus other activities, I know you don't discount collections because you have a huge collection yourself that you're very proud of. But you left out something I know is something you spend a lot of time on, which is access. So I have a feeling that if you would talk more about collection and access, I'd feel a little more comfortable about de-emphasizing some aspects of collection, physical collection. The comments that you made about people studying in a room, well, of course, we have a Jewish tradition, chavruta, okay? And there's actually studies of how valuable that is. But the question I ask in my library, which is Brandeis University, we have some places where people can study, and there are other activities, but I know that for every study area, there's a section of the stacks that has to be dealt with, which probably means deaccessioning, and that's a very polite word for recycling books, and they're not always books that we have access to in some other format. And I don't always understand why this activity has to be in the library, because there's no interaction with the librarian. Or we now have a digital humanities lab where we have faculty and professors working with others around the country to digitize all the early medieval Homer manuscripts, for example. I understand the process comes under can relate to us, but why should that take up space in the library? What does it accomplish if it's going to mean that we have less room for a physical activity or some other physical space for books? The other question I want to mention is the restricting of collections for a variety of reasons, because some of us were discussing that at lunch. I think we all probably believe in freedom of access, but it's a little more serious question from a practical point of view. For example, if there's an anti-Semitic picture. Now, my library has a Dreyfus collection. We have digitized it, and I think it's all going to go into Judaica, Europeana, and so on. But the question is, what if it's a very anti-Semitic picture? Text, I don't know how much people are going to quote, but that's a very serious issue if it's going to be used by anti-Semites. And you just had a debate the other day in the papers here, because Haaretz had this picture of an Israeli, I don't remember, was a plane or a missile, flying into the buildings from 9/11. I thought it was outrageous that the paper put that out, because they didn't realize how anti-Semites and anti-Zionists will use it. So without wanting to be censors, how do we draw the line? What would happen if somebody used that picture and somebody got hurt as a result of that? So that's a concern I have.
Do you want to respond?
No, you.
Those are all very important questions, and I guess I'll try to respond very quickly in order of the question. I didn't focus on access because I feel I've moved. I believe in access. I've worked through access, and each step of my own career, coming to work in the library, working on Geniza fragments, understanding how integrated access has really been transformative for me. And I was really kind of following on Emil's point, which is we have access now to a lot of stuff. And we haven't really thought yet in any systematic way about what we want to do with all of this great access we have. It's not that we need to stop providing access, just the opposite. I've argued for open access. But what's the point? This is a great opportunity to think about what's meaningful. In terms of group study space, look, space is the most precious commodity in a library, and the trade-off between what they call collaboratories and stack space is an ongoing issue. You could argue that we don't need books in libraries if we have digital browsing. If you could browse the titles on a shelf, and then you could literally pull a full-text version of a particular book off of a shelf, then why do we need library spaces? I think we need library spaces precisely because they're social spaces, and that they're opportunities for people to come together in ways that don't happen when they're just remotely connecting to each other. And I'd make the further point that at Penn, we have a tremendous emphasis within the libraries on what we call the material text, and that, just as was alluded to earlier, that there are things you can do with technology that you can't do in person, and there are things that you can only do in person that you can't do with technology. And I think that a truly collaborative and multi-formatted learning environment is an integrated opportunity to combine physical and virtual in ways that we haven't, again, really begun to think through. Rather than either or, what's the relationship between the physical and the virtual in terms of actual library space? I do think there is a reason for having these spaces in libraries. And I think that library pedagogy and library classrooms offer an alternative model, actually, to what we traditionally find. Sorry, I'm slowing down here for you, but so I've answered the question. I've tried to answer that point about digital humanities then. You know, restricting collections, open access, freedom of speech, First Amendment. The way the Supreme Court ruled is basically that if you yell fire in a theater and you cause people to be harmed, then there is a immediate danger, a clear and immediate danger. The British Library, and I've just recently learned of it, has a methodology and I guess they've thought very carefully about what they put online, and there is a vetting process. And I think your distinction between text and image is an important one that we should keep in mind. But if a text is offensive, profoundly offensive, and profoundly anti-Semitic, and an image is even more disgusting, and it doesn't lead to any kind of immediate action or hurt, I think that the whole notion of taboo and restriction actually only intensifies interest, lurid or otherwise. And so, from my point of view, the trade-off between restriction and open access and the potential for creativity and growth far outweigh the costs of restricting access, if only administratively. Every time a researcher wants to take not only the image of our collection, but the actual encoded form of it, take it apart and reuse it in any way they want without having to come to us and have a series of exchanges by email or by letter about permission, I find wonderful.
Yaacov, as the state archivist, where certainly that problem that he just dealt with at last comes up, would love to hear your comments in general.
I fully agree with what Arthur just said, but I come, unfortunately, from a very different place. The law in Israel is that material which is in the archive is closed. And eventually it will be open, but first it's closed. And when the law that we act according to right now, which was passed in 1955, we're working on an updated law. But the law that we still operate on and the decrees that were formulated under it have a series of periods of years in which material is closed. So normal, banal stuff, non-classified from a government agency of any sort is open after 15 years. But there's some material that's open after 30 years or 50 years or sometimes even 70. Material that has personal information theoretically should be sealed for as long as the person is alive, and in some cases even as long as the family will be hurt by its being disclosed, and there's no way you can know when that is. So at the moment, unfortunately, the problem that we deal with is that just about everything is closed. And as long as we had a reading room and people came to the reading room, or they went to our medieval website and they sent an email from it saying, we want to see this and this and this, as long as we're talking about a few thousand people a year, and literally no more than that, a few thousand people a year and a few tens of thousands of files a year, 30, 40, 50,000 files a year, we were able to declassify what people requested according to their requests. And we have a schedule of this will be declassified, and so there are some things that we declassify according to series on our own schedule, but basically many people would come and ask for stuff which has not been declassified, and so in the 2 days before we come, we'll quickly declassify it for them. And in most cases, we will indeed declassify it, not always. When we come to the idea of taking the entire thing and putting it on the web, it's a totally different ballgame. We have a backlog of literally, backlog now, I mean material which the period of which it's supposed to be sealed has passed and it should have opened. So non-classified material from up till the year 2000, for example. Right? Classified security documents up until 1964. So that's material which legally should be open already. We have a backlog there of tens of thousands of years of labor, literally. Not hundreds of thousands, but many, 10, 20,000 years at least, put in the military archive, which is part of the state archive, the numbers will grow even higher. So we're building systems which will enable us to do this with, to a certain extent, with lower quality or less well-trained professionals. For example, by building a digital knowledge base of decisions. When you encounter something like this, the decision is yes. When you encounter something like this, the decision is no. When you have a system like that, you can take students who don't have 20 years of experience, and maybe you can give them 3 months of experience, and they'll be able to declassify banal material, unclassified material. They won't be able so that's one aspect of it. I could spend another 3 hours talking about that. The second is, of course, okay, you build a system and you figure out that you want to do it. You still have the question of when you make which decision. So the law has a list, or a decree, it's not a law, has a list of 10 parameters according to which we can keep material sealed. Now, they're the same 10 parameters in any democratic country. There's nothing unusual about them. Security, state security, diplomatic need, personal privacy. There are 10 of them, and only 3 or 4 of them are active. They're all acceptable. The question then comes when I'm looking at a specific file, is this file a danger to the security of the state to open it or not? And that is very hard to respond to. And at the moment, I can tell you that we're at the early stages of a roaring debate in which parts of the establishment are much more conservative than other parts. That's as far as I'll take it. And this is happening on various levels, including the Supreme Court. That's also part of it. But how do you decide? And who decides, and according to what? So this challenge I sort of glibly said, let's put it all online and give it to the mathematicians. That was nice, but the reality is it's not so easy to do.
Could I respond to this point about libraries versus archives?
Yeah, absolutely. It really interested me just as a question, what implications that might have for a normal civilian library in terms of setting up parameters and answering questions. But Arthur, you do that first.
Something to this point. What is the use to talk about restricting a collection when the internet is bombarded with a wealth of materials? Meaning, if an anti-Semitic won't get it from me, it will get it from. I think the horses are already gone, and the gates are open, and so I think it's pointless.
Well, I agree with that point, and why the Dreyfus material is widely available, and I don't think that it depends. The world depends on whether or not we make our version or our samples of it available. But I'd like to address, if I may, the difference between libraries and archives. For me, my original training actually was as an archivist, and I believe archivists and for various reasons have an almost opposite methodology. And here's the difference. For me, libraries are symbols of openness and open access. For me, archives are the defender of privacy. And in a democratic society, those are always two competing values. As you know, the questions of declassification, state security issues, these are not the same kinds of things as speech suppression. And I would ask you if, when you have to make a decision about declassifying something, it's not because it's probably obscene, but because it's considered, whether it's debatable, it's a matter of state security.
It's a matter of harming somebody.
Of harm, not offense. And so there are many legal differences. The responsibility of an archive has legal implications that libraries don't. I was speaking about libraries, and I completely respect and actually agree with everything you say about the role of the archive and the difference between the two roles in a society, in a democratic society.
Do either Hezi or Yoel have, or can we open up for more questions? Okay.
I was going to say, the two of you are dealing to some degree in black and white. I'm an author's situation, which is in a university setting, and I came to archives as a librarian, not as an archivist. When we're dealing with issues of harm and so forth, there's no question, but there are gray areas. And we have archives at Yale that relate to the state of Israel, let's say, that are not state security issues, but could be embarrassing, could be what do you do? I mean, this is my,
Well,
it's,
that's
it's,
the question they're dealing with is how do you set the parameters?
yes,
Of
so
course,
I'm
and I
looking
would
for
imagine everybody
guidance with
faces
this
that
sort
to
of
one
thing
degree
too.
or
I mean,
another.
it's a very problematic space there.
Can I just, I just want to respond very, very briefly. Embarrassment to the state of Israel is not a reason to keep anything closed.
And certainly hasn't been recently. Yeah, David Kramer?
I think this question of openness, what we protect, what we don't protect, is probably the most interesting question on the floor right now. But I'd actually like to ask a question that goes a different direction.
That's just fine.
Since the subject is audiences, and we've got here libraries and collections with very different missions. Some, like the Sifriya Leumit, with a mission that's far broader, for example, than academic libraries. I suspect my question is more toward for academic libraries, but I'll ask it broadly. Both here in Israel and in the United States today, Jewish studies is contracting significantly. The number of students in Jewish studies, both at basic levels and advanced levels, is much smaller and decreasing. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily predict the future. But there are also reasons to believe that things will not improve very much in the near future. Given that, the smaller number of students, the smaller number of researchers, and the recognition that in order to keep research going, we're going to need to expand the base. There are going to need to be populations who come to Jewish studies who are not Jewish, who do not necessarily have the languages, and so forth. How does that affect our consideration of our audiences and how we prepare material for them to use?
Hezi, you want to try that one?
אז כמו שאמרת, באמת זה מיועד יותר לספריות אוניברסיטאיות, ועל זה אני יכול לענות את מה שכבר אמרתי בדברים שלי. אני באמת חושב שזאת עוד סיבה למה אנחנו צריכים לראות לפנינו הרבה מעבר לסטודנטים ולמורים, למרצים. ברגע שאתה מסתכל, נניח בארצות הברית, בישראל זה ברור, על הציבור עשוי לגלות עניין בחומרים שיש אצלך, אני חושב שהרחבת מאוד את הקהל יעד שלך, שהיום הוא יותר מבעבר, יכול להגיע, מתעניין ויכול להגיע אל החומרים שאתה מחזיק, ואני לא חושב שיש בזה שום פסול או פחיתות כבוד. אני באמת חושב, כמו שאמרתי בסיום דבריי, שלא תהיה הצדקה להחזיק, לפתח אוספים שמיועדים לקהל כל כך קטן שהוא עוד מצטמצם.
Please, Yoel.
First of all, I think that that's a fantastic question, but I think it relates back to the broader question of the way in which the libraries set the groundwork for the possibility of future research without actually knowing what people are going to do with it. If we say, well, this is not what you're suggesting, but if we would say the situation is shrinking, there are fewer and fewer researchers and scholars and whatever, so, well, what's the point? Then there won't be any future. And if we create the groundwork which makes that possible and creates, access, so then the graduate students and the researchers and the Kahal Rachav, will be able to search underneath, look underneath the searchlight. Just one point about language, which I'm gonna echo Leon Wieseltier here and suggest that the American Jewish community, which thinks that it can make significant and long-lasting contributions to Jewish culture in a big way in capital letters without competence in any Jewish language, they've got a huge uphill battle, and I'm pretty skeptical about the possibility. You can't get past the languages to do serious research. Right, I know. But if you're talking about a population, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, who don't have the language competence to deal with the materials, then it almost sounds like a non-starter,
And it doesn't matter if it's Jewish studies or Italian studies. The problem that you're suggesting here is in general in humanities, not necessarily in Jewish studies. there is no, but I think that the point that I might suggest is that when you collect materials that are not necessarily related to a language or the history of, for instance, we have a lot of video cassettes that are related to the environmental studies that are in Hebrew. So the contribution of that is to translate it because it will be interdisciplinary, cross-cultural research that you can allow people by doing that. And that will be many things like that, computer science or anything that it's a interdisciplinary, that language is not requirement. But humanity without knowing the language, there is no really, it's nothing to do with the Jewish study or Greek study or Italian study. Either you know the language or you don't know the language.
And Americans don't learn languages.
Right, and the primary resource of any culture is based on the language.
So, Amiur?
Actually, in response to David also, what you're describing is actually happening or is already the case in larger parts of Europe. So if you look at Jewish studies and the situation of Jewish studies in Europe, I would say that 50% of all researchers of Jewish studies in Europe are non-Jewish. And actually, it has hardly any influence on the level. It's certainly true in places like Germany, France, Holland. Apparently, the influence of that on the quality of what is happening is not all that bad, frankly. Second, in response to basically to everything and to the thing about audiences, it's right exactly this, the digitization effort and all that's going on with the digitization is a way to bring all these new potential audiences together. In a world that is decreasing, you can, and fear is not part of that deal. I mean, you have to get out there, you have to get the material out there, and if you create these spaces, to give you an idea, I teach to 5 students in history of the Jewish book. I give lectures to anything between 15 and 300 people on the history of the Jewish book. For the Berginsky collection, a private collection that exhibitions for, we reached out to 60,000 people with our exhibitions. We reached out to tens of thousands of people through our websites and through our iPad apps. And the digital world can create these new spaces where we can actually also reach out to these new audiences. And the big challenge is to get the material out there to the people who really need it. And I think we should not be afraid of misuses. And what I like best, frankly, and then I stop, is the aspects of idealism in your talk. And
can you pass it, Emil, to the left, your left in the back?
אני פשוט חייבת להגיב שנייה לפני סלחו לי בעברית, שנייה לפני שסוגרים את החדר קריאה בארכיון המדינה, שאני השתמשתי בו כמה וכמה פעמים, ואני מדברת עכשיו עם הכובע שאני ספרנית יעץ בעולם קרא יהדות, שהאינטראקציה, אחת מהאינטראקציות היפות שקורות בספרייה, האינטראקציה בין הספרן לבין הקורא. ויש לה חשיבות מאוד גדולה. ספרנים הם סוג של, אני רואה אותם אופטימטריסטים. מגיע אליהם איזשהו בן אדם והם צריכים להתאים לו את המשקפיים שהוא מחפש בים הידע. ככל שהקהל שלנו יהפוך להיות יותר רחב, יהיה צריך הרבה יותר את העזרה של הספרן. רק לתת לו ולשפוך את החומר לאינטרנט זה לא מספיק, רק לעשות דיגיטציה של חומרים. רוב האנשים פשוט הולכים לאיבוד, יש לנו פה אוסף של אלפי מפות עתיקות, רוב האנשים בכלל לא יודעים איך לבחור את המפה שתתאים להם בשביל לענות על השאלה שלהם. אני אחמיא לרגע לשיתוף פעולה שקרה לי לפני כמה זמן, קיבלתי אימייל מגברת שחיפשה ספינת מעפילים. היא בעצם לא הצליחה להבין שמדובר, היא חיפשה את הספינת מעפילים שעליה עלה אביה לארץ, ולמעשה היא לא שמה לב שיש 2 ספינות מעפילים באותו שם. מעבר לזה, שבמקרה בגלל שהשתמשתי בצורה נהדרת וקיבלתי שירות נהדר, אז חשבתי מיד על הארכיון של גנזך המדינה, וענתה לי ספרנית שמה באימייל, שבהחלט הסתבר שכל התיק היה שם. עכשיו, הפתרון לאותה גברת הגיע באמת משיתוף פעולה בין שני ספרנים. זה שיתוף פעולה שקורה כל יום. אנחנו פוגשים את הקליינטים שלנו ויכולים לעזור להם בעזרת היכולת שלנו להתמצא במרחב של המידע. אנחנו עוזרים להם בצ'אט, אנחנו עוזרים להם בכל מיני צורות אונליין. זה אף פעם לא מגיע לאותה יכולת של עזרה כמו מישהו שנכנס ומתיישב לידינו מהצד השני של השולחן.
אם אפשר להעביר את זה כל הדרך בימין שלך, בבקשה.
אני הייתי רוצה להעלות איזושהי בעיית יסוד שלא עלתה כאן, ושהאוצרים והספרנים יכולים לתרום לה תרומה מכרעת. בעיניי המהפכה שאנחנו חווים אותה באינטרנט בעצם ממוקדת לאמיתו של דבר בשני דברים. דבר אחד, מהירות העדכון של הידע. ואני לא אכנס לנושא הזה. הדבר השני שאני אכנס אליו זה הדמוקרטיזציה של הידע. המצב שכל אדם שיש לו מכשיר קטן וחיבור לאינטרנט יכול להגיע למקורות הידע הטובים ביותר, בפוטנציה, ולעשות שימוש ולהפיץ את הדברים שלו ברחבי העולם, ולהמציא כל מיני דברים, ולהפוך מחסר פרוטה פתאום לבעל הון. זאת המהפכה הגדולה של האינטרנט. אבל תוך שאנחנו חווים את המהפכה הזאת, המהפכה מתעתעת בנו. היא לא מראה לנו היכן נכנסים כל מיני גורמים אחרים לתמונה ומעוותים לחלוטין את המצב, את הדמוקרטיזציה הזאת. אתה הזכרת, ארתור, אמרת שהאתר JPress שינה את המחקר וכן הלאה. אבל לפעמים אני עומד בתור אחד מהאנשים של JPress ותוהה כמה אנחנו מעוותים את התמונה. אם אנחנו מכניסים איזשהו עיתון שולי ואנחנו נותנים פתאום לעיתון השולי הזה, הוא היחידי מארצות הברית שנמצא באתר שלנו, פתאום אכן כותבים יותר עבודות סמינריוניות ועבודות דוקטור שמשתמשים בו, אבל מה עשינו כאן? זה עיוות מוחלט של המצב, זה לא תרומה למחקר. עכשיו, כלומר, צריך איזושהי מעורבות שצריך למצוא לה את הדרך הדמוקרטית להתפתח, כדי להשתמש שימוש מושכל בשינוי המהפכני הזה שמתרחש. עכשיו זה אפשר אולי לעשות, אבל דבר אחר שאתם לא יודע כמה אתם ערים לו, חברות הידע המסחריות מונעות למעשה, או בעלי זכויות, מונעות ומעמדות מכשולים קשים בפני הדמוקרטיזציה. אם אנחנו לוקחים שוב, אני לוקח דוגמאות ממה שאני מכיר JPress, כי שם אני חווה את הניסיונות האלה, אז שני העיתונים החשובים ביותר במדינת ישראל, שהם בידיים פרטיות, ידיעות אחרונות והארץ, מסרבים לשתף איתנו פעולה. ואנחנו מבחינה זאת מעוותים את התמונה המתקבלת מ-JPress מעוותת. אבל זה אפשר להבין, זה בעלי זכויות, מה אתה יכול להגיד להם? אבל כאשר מתברר לך שלעיתונות יהודית אמריקאית אתה לא יכול להגיע כי הזכויות הם נמכרו בנזיד עדשים לפרוקווסט, אז אתה שואל את עצמך גם מבחינה מורלית מה קרה כאן. ואם ספרנים ועוצרים קונים אחר כך מפרוקווסט בעשרות אלפי דולרים את הדברים.
I'm sorry, but we read.
אוקיי, אני חושב שאני נוגע כאן בשאלה מאוד מאוד יסודית, באמת עקרונית כאן, לא סיפור, אני כבר מסיים. אם זה מתרחש, השאלה מה אנחנו יכולים לעשות כדי לנצל את הדמוקרטיזציה הזאת, שהיא ההישג העיקרי של האינטרנט. תודה.
There is no more time, but I'm still going to leave you with a thought which I talked about before about my best friend Al Moldovan. He mentioned Selma and the march in Selma when Al was not only the personal doctor, but slept on the floor outside his door. Many of you have, I'm sure, heard of Bloody Sunday in Selma. And this was a situation where there was a bridge between Selma and the other side of the river, and the demonstrators were on the Selma side and were being attacked by the police and dogs and tear gas and every substantially brutal way, and many people were wounded. And there was a group of doctors and ambulances on the other side. And between them, at the entrance to the bridge, was a sheriff and his few men with drawn pistols, saying to these ambulances, if anybody makes a move, we're going to shoot you. And Al was the only one. He looked at him and he said, shoot me. And he took the ambulance and he went across the bridge and he treated the wounded. And the reason I tell it is not because of who he was, although that's also true. But sometimes, even I think in what we all do, sometimes we're standing on one side of the bridge and we know that we have to be on that other side, and there are people standing in front of us saying no, and we just have to say, then shoot me, and do it. There's enough to be done that way. Thank you very much.